The police officers stopped a couple and assaulted the wife right in front of her husband, unaware that he was the police captain. When the truth came to light, they were shocked by the consequences awaiting them. Walter Reed, an experienced and formidable police captain, was known for his tall, strong build and chiseled features. His sharp eyes and steadfast gaze commanded respect, but to friends and family, his eyes also revealed a caring and responsible nature. After dedicating decades to serving one of the city's most complex and challenging areas, Walter was no stranger to the darkest sides of life. From tense drug busts and family disputes ending in tragedy, to confrontations with the ruthless violence of the streets. Despite the hardships of his work, he remained committed to justice and integrity, even while navigating a system often clouded by prejudice and bias. But tonight was entirely different. Tonight, Walter was not just a brave police captain in the line of duty. He was a husband on the verge of becoming a father, a man facing a personal and urgent event beyond any mission he had encountered before. Above all, tonight was a test not only of courage, but of the family responsibility he cherished deeply. When his phone rang, Walter was across the city, finishing up paperwork for an important case. The screen displayed the name of his wife, Nancy, the person he regarded as his source of peace after long, exhausting days. He answered the call and immediately sensed something was wrong. Nancy's voice came through, trembling and interrupted by quick breaths. She was enduring pain and intense worry. "Walter, the contractions have started. I think it's time," Nancy said, her voice a mix of excitement and clear fear. Walter's heart raced as he felt a surge of adrenaline, his blood flowing faster than ever. Her words were not just an alert, they were a call to duty, a duty as a husband and soon-to-be father. He could hear the anxiety in her voice, but also sensed her trust in him to get her safely to the hospital, a place where she could deliver their baby with him by her side. They had talked about this moment many times, prepared mentally, taken prenatal classes, and discussed every detail of an emergency plan. But now those plans seemed fragile before reality, and emotions overwhelmed them. Without hesitation, Walter abandoned everything on his desk, grabbed his car keys, and rushed out of the station. He drove home as quickly as possible, genuinely wishing he would make it in time before things worsened. Known for his calm under pressure, he found this time to be different. This time, it wasn't just his life on the line, but the lives of the people he loved most. The thought of Nancy in pain and their unborn child's uncertain safety threw him into a whirlwind of unfamiliar emotions, anxiety, fear, and an uncontrollable surge of excitement. As he navigated the city streets, Walter's mind raced with worry and fear. He wondered if he could reach home in time, if everything would go smoothly, and if Nancy and their child would be safe. With each passing second, the responsibility and love in his heart beat louder. Recalling the plans they had laid out, he tried to reassure himself that everything would be okay, that this was just a small test in the journey he and Nancy had prepared for. But then he realized no plan, no preparation could have readied him for the flood of emotions surging inside. Walter turned on his emergency lights, pressed the accelerator, and sped through the streets, disregarding speed limits, with only one goal in his mind: to reach home, to get Nancy to the hospital safely. He reminded himself that his colleagues on the road would understand his urgency, but he couldn't shake the worry that he could face trouble if no one understood the real reason behind his haste, especially because he knew he was a black man. And in this city, power could sometimes be a tool of abuse rather than protection. In the sparse evening traffic, Walter sped through intersections and side streets, his eyes constantly scanning to avoid obstacles. The closer he got to home, the more his anxiety mixed with the hope that he would arrive in time to ensure Nancy's safety. At that moment, Nancy and their unborn child were everything to him, the sole motivation keeping him racing forward in this urgent battle against time. Finally, after what felt like an endless drive, Walter arrived at the building where he and Nancy lived. The car came to a screeching halt, and Walter rushed out, his eyes filled with worry as he looked toward the entrance, his feet moving swiftly across the yard, knowing that every second counted. He practically flew up the stairs, each step echoing with his hurried footsteps, his mind focused solely on one thing: Nancy! When he entered their apartment, he found her in the living room, clutching her stomach, her body slightly hunched over to ease the pain. Her hair was damp with sweat, sticking to her forehead, her breathing fast and labored, her face tense with contractions. The moment she saw him, her eyes lit up with relief and an indescribable joy, as though Walter was the one anchor in this storm. "Walter, thank goodness you're here," she whispered, her voice trembling from the pain yet filled with complete trust. She reached out her hand to him, her eyes expressing the comfort his presence gave her. Walter immediately knelt beside her, his large, warm hand clasping hers firmly, radiating the calm and reassurance only he could bring. "I'm here, love. I won't let you go through this alone," he said in a deep, steady voice full of resolve. "I'll get you to the hospital. Everything's going to be all right." Carefully, he wrapped his arm around her waist, gently helping her to stand. Every movement was tender, as if he were handling the most fragile treasure. Nancy leaned. Against him, her legs shaky from the relentless waves of pain, her breathing uneven as each step became heavier. Together, they slowly made their way down the stairs, with Walter holding her close, whispering comforting words. "It's going to be all right, love. I'm right here." When they reached the car, he carefully opened the door and helped her into the seat. His gaze never left her face, watching her every expression to make sure she was okay. He buckled her seatbelt, his fingers moving gently, cautiously, as if afraid to cause her any more discomfort. Before starting the engine, he placed his hand on her shoulder, looking into her eyes with depth and unwavering determination. "I'll get you there safely," he said, his voice steady and his eyes filled with fierce resolve. Nancy managed a small, shaky smile, her eyes reflecting her absolute trust in him, the comfort he brought her in this difficult moment. "I know," she whispered, her voice faint but filled with emotion. Walter turned back, his hands trembling slightly from the emotions overwhelming him, but he quickly regained his composure. He knew this was a moment when he had to be strong, the solid ground for the woman he loved and their soon-to-be-born child. As he started the car and accelerated, he kept his gaze forward, yet his heart pounded with a mixture of worry and determination. She meant everything to him, and in this moment, nothing was more important than getting her safely to the hospital. As they drove, he frequently glanced at her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his fingers tracing small circles as a way to calm her. Walter took deep, steady breaths, focusing on the road ahead, but in his mind he relived every joyful moment with her, from the day they met to the plans they had carefully made for this day. They had attended prenatal classes and discussed every possible scenario, but nothing could truly prepare him for the overwhelming love and concern he felt now. Throughout the journey, their eyes met occasionally, a silent exchange filled with everything they wanted to say without words. Just having Walter by her side gave Nancy the strength she needed, and Walter knew he would do anything to protect the woman he loved and their child soon to arrive. As Walter sped through the streets, his only hope was to get Nancy to the hospital safely. The emergency lights flashed urgently, but as Walter focused on the road ahead, he didn't notice the red and blue lights of a patrol car following close behind him. Just as Walter turned onto a major avenue, the flashing lights from the patrol car suddenly illuminated his rearview mirror, sending a surge of anxiety through him as he realized he was being pursued by the police. Although he tried to focus on getting Nancy to the hospital, Walter knew he couldn't ignore the patrol car behind him. He silently prayed the officers would understand the urgency of the situation when they saw Nancy in distress. Finally, he had no choice but to pull over, anxiously glancing at Nancy, who was writhing in pain, hoping he could quickly explain and get back on the road. When the car came to a stop, two officers stepped out of the patrol car, their faces cast in stern, unyielding expressions under the glare of their headlights. One of them was a tall man with a cold, suspicious gaze, while the other, shorter with a stockier build, wore a look of unmistakable disdain. They approached Walter's car, shining a flashlight directly into his face through the window. Walter rolled down the window, doing his best to remain calm. Before he could say a word, the taller officer pointed the flashlight at his face and barked, "What do you think you're doing driving at that speed, pal?" Walter took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice as steady as possible. "I'm sorry, but my wife, she's in labor. I need to get her to the hospital immediately." His voice held a desperate urgency, hoping they would grasp the gravity of the situation. The shorter officer narrowed his eyes, noticing the police badge on Walter's shirt, and smirked derisively. "Oh, so you're a police captain, huh?" His tone was dripping with sarcasm. You think that badge gives you the right to speed and break the law? Walter swallowed hard, attempting to explain further. I'm not trying to break any laws. It's just that this is an emergency. Please, my wife is in severe pain, and our baby is coming. But Walter's pleas only seemed to fuel the officer's suspicion, and they appeared to relish making things more difficult for him. The tall officer, with a stony glare, pointed outside the car, ordering, "Step out of the vehicle, now." Walter hesitated, glancing back at Nancy. She was grimacing in pain, clutching the seat with a pale face, her eyes filled with worry and a hint of fear. Walter knew he had no choice but to comply, hoping that cooperating would resolve the situation quickly. He slowly opened the door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible to avoid any misunderstandings. Facing the two officers, Walter tried once more to explain his emergency, but he could see the cold indifference in their eyes. The shorter officer moved closer, his voice laced with contempt. "Who do you think you are, driving like a maniac and breaking the law? You think being a captain means you get special privileges?" Walter maintained a steady but firm tone. "I'm only asking for some understanding. My wife is in an emergency. She needs to get to the hospital right now." The tall officer scoffed, showing no signs of empathy. Instead, his hand moved to his holster, a glint of threat in his eyes. "Listen here, buddy. If you don't cooperate right now, I won't hesitate to use force." Fear and anger surged within Walter. He was used to high-stakes situations at work, but this was the first time he felt genuinely threatened, not for his own life, but for the lives of Nancy and their unborn child. Walter took a deep breath, doing his best to remain calm. "Please, understand me. This is a life-or-death situation. I just want to get my wife to the hospital. Please, let us go." But his pleas were met with icy disdain. The shorter officer sneered, his tone mocking. "Don't even try to pull that excuse on us. I've met plenty of people who think they're special, but let me assure you, you're not." Walter clenched his fists, but he knew he couldn't afford to act rashly. Every second counted for Nancy, but if he did anything to resist, the situation could spiral even further out of control. He looked into the officer's eyes, trying one last time to reach them. "I'm only asking for compassion. Please, let us go. We can explain everything later. But right now, my wife is in urgent need of medical care." The tall officer smirked, his expression contemptuous, as if Walter were just another nobody, not a police captain. "Cooperate, or I'll show you what enforcing the law means," he threatened, his hand moving even closer to his gun. Walter felt a surge of helpless rage rising within him. He realized that these men had no intention of helping. They only wanted to flaunt their authority. Deep down, he also knew they might have held a bias against him the moment they saw him in the car. Standing before these two officers, Walter was no longer just a worried husband. He was also a man of color in a precarious situation that could be dangerously misinterpreted. He glanced back at the car, where Nancy continued to struggle with the pain, her eyes filled with tears and fear as she watched the escalating tension. Her gaze seemed to plead with him to find a way to get her out of this situation. This helplessness felt like a knife twisting in his heart. But he knew that, no matter how tense things got, he had to keep calm for Nancy and their unborn child. Walter took a deep breath, suppressing his frustration, and looked straight into the officer's eyes, his voice low but resolute. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for a bit of humanity. Please, just let us go." But his words fell into a void. The officer's expressions remained hostile and unyielding, like he was speaking to two unfeeling walls. Walter realized that every plea was in vain, but for Nancy and their child, he had no choice but to endure, hoping he could somehow get her to safety before it was too late. Walter decided to take out his police badge, hoping it would help explain and de-escalate the tension, but the shorter officer quickly moved closer and snatched the wallet from his hand. He opened it, glanced at the badge, and sneered with contempt. "Really? A police captain?" he asked mockingly, his tone dripping with sarcasm, and his eyes filled with skepticism and disdain. "You think that title gives you the right to break the law? You think you're above everyone else?" Walter maintained his composure, trying to explain even as his heart raced with worry for Nancy. "My wife, she's in labor. She needs to get to the hospital immediately. I'm just asking for a bit of understanding." But the taller officer cut him off with a cold, challenging look. "You think you're special, huh, buddy? Think that because you're a captain, you get to do whatever you want, break any rule you feel like. From inside the car, Nancy, suffering and distressed, watched as her husband endured unwarranted humiliation and injustice. She tried to open the car door, even as the pain grew stronger, and weakly called out his name. "Please, I just need to get to the hospital. My husband hasn't done anything wrong." Her voice trembling but filled with determination and desperation. The shorter officer turned around, his tone harsh and filled with anger, as if her presence was only adding to his annoyance. "Get back in the car! You're not allowed to get out!" he barked, his eyes cold, utterly devoid of compassion. Walter looked at Nancy trembling inside the car, her face pale with pain, yet her eyes full of resilience. In her gaze, Walter saw a silent empathy and encouragement. Even amidst intense pain, Nancy looked at him with a faint, brave smile, as if to say she understood and believed in him, that she would stand by him through this. Her eyes sent him an unspoken message. "Stay calm, for me and the baby." That moment filled Walter with profound emotion. Nancy's love and resilience, even in the throes of labor, reminded him why he had to remain calm and strong. No matter how difficult the situation or how unfairly he was treated, Walter knew he had to suppress his anger and let nothing cloud his judgment. But just as Walter took a deep breath to regain his composure, the taller officer suddenly stepped forward, shoving him hard on the shoulder, causing him to stumble. "Stay put! Don't even think about resisting," he shouted, his voice filled with authority and threat. Walter staggered but managed to keep his balance, looking at the officer with fury in his eyes, but holding his silence. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I'm just asking you to let us go. My wife is in pain and needs urgent medical attention." His plea was met with nothing but a mocking laugh from the shorter officer. He stepped up close to Walter, sneering with disdain. "Don't think we'll go easy on you just because you're a captain. You're just another guy. And if you don't cooperate, we'll make you cooperate." Walter clenched his fists, the anger rising in his chest. He knew he didn't deserve to be treated this way, but any attempt to resist would only worsen the situation. And the last thing he wanted was to endanger Nancy and their unborn child. He looked at the officer with determination, trying to convey the sincerity and urgency of the situation he was facing. From inside the car, Nancy, though in pain, observed everything. She could see the unfairness her husband was enduring and felt his hurt and frustration. Yet she patiently kept her gaze on him, her eyes wet with tears yet full of strength and hope. Even in pain, she managed a faint smile at him, a fragile but deeply loving and supportive smile. She wanted him to know she understood the helplessness he was experiencing and that, no matter what, she was on his side. When Walter looked into Nancy's eyes, he felt a powerful surge of motivation within him. He remembered all they had been through together, the sacrifices and hardships, and he knew he had to keep calm and composed, not just for himself, but for Nancy and their soon-to-be-born child. At that moment, Walter understood that their love and resilience would be the strength he needed to face any hostility or injustice. He would not let anyone harm his family, and even if he had to endure humiliation, he would stand firm because, in Nancy's eyes, he saw her unwavering trust and hope. Amid the darkness and the flashing lights of the police car, their love and strength shone brightly, reminding him that they would overcome everything, no matter the challenges and trials ahead. Meanwhile, a young man passing by was drawn to the shouting and flashing lights of the police car. As he approached, he saw a tense and alarming scene. A black man being restrained by two police officers while a woman in the car cried out in pain. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and began recording the entire situation. He could sense the injustice unfolding right in front of him and knew that if he didn't do something, the truth might be buried. He posted the video on social media with a brief caption: "Police captain and his wife in labor treated with brutality and unfairness. It's time to demand justice." The video quickly went viral, and within minutes, thousands of views and comments began flooding in. Viewers couldn't believe what they were seeing. Outrage erupted as people expressed shock and anger over the officers' actions. Their cold, inhumane, and abusive behavior sparked widespread indignation. Comments poured in under the video, with many criticizing and expressing fury at the officers' actions while demanding that authorities take immediate action. The public's attention grew rapidly, and the pressure from social media began to weigh heavily on the scene unfolding in real time. Meanwhile, the two officers noticed the skeptical, disapproving gazes from the gathering crowd. The glow from cell phones recording them served as a warning, making them realize that their actions were no longer hidden from the public eye. However, rather than stopping, the shorter officer appeared visibly uneasy and irritated. He shouted at the crowd, "Nobody interferes with this. This is official business. Everyone back off." But his voice no longer held the confidence it once had. There was an unmistakable hint of worry and fear. Walter, though restrained against the car, realized that the situation might be shifting. The eyes of the crowd, the recording phones, and especially the angered expression of the young man who had stepped up to help him, all served as a morale boost, making him feel less alone. A glimmer of hope surfaced within him that maybe, just maybe, the truth wouldn't be buried this time. Nancy, sitting in the car, noticed the concerned looks of those around and the growing crowd. Despite the intensifying pain, she felt some comfort in seeing people standing up for her and Walter. She knew that the young man's video might be their only hope of finding justice. Under the pressure from the crowd and the anger of those witnessing the event, the two officers began to show signs of hesitation. The shorter officer, who had initially acted tough, now displayed evident worry. He looked at his partner, his face betraying confusion and frustration, uncertain about what to do next. Both officers seemed to understand that every move they made was now under tight scrutiny and that any misstep could be used as evidence against them. Meanwhile, Walter, though held firmly in place, continued to try to speak to the officers with a calm but determined voice. "My wife is in an emergency. We just need to get to the hospital. Please, reconsider." The taller officer turned to look at Walter, his face full of anger, but this time with a hint of worry in his eyes. He knew that everything he was doing was being recorded and that any action that crossed the line could lead to severe consequences. He hesitated for a moment but tried to maintain his authoritative tone. "We'll handle everything according to protocol. If you don't cooperate, we'll continue to do our job as required." The tension continued to escalate as murmurs from the crowd grew louder, with increasingly clear words of criticism. "Don't they see she's in pain?" someone from the crowd shouted. "Come on, they just need to get to the hospital," protested another voice, full of frustration. The shouting and calls from the crowd seemed to erode the officers' confidence. They understood they couldn't escape the watchful eyes of the public and that their actions had become the center of attention. The two officers exchanged worried glances, appearing to reconsider their approach to the situation. As the tense confrontation between Walter and the two officers reached its peak, an unmarked car screeched to a halt at the scene. Walter looked up and saw a familiar figure, Keith David, a veteran detective and his closest friend. Keith stepped out of the car, his eyes filled with fury and determination, as he took in the distressing situation Walter and Nancy were enduring. Known throughout the department as a tough but righteous detective, Keith couldn't believe his eyes as he saw his longtime colleague being treated like a criminal in the middle of the street by two younger officers. He quickly approached Walter, his gaze radiating outrage. Under the glow of the crowd's phone lights, Keith appeared like a guardian, and the people around fell silent, watching his every step. Keith walked straight up to the two officers, his gaze icy. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" His voice rang out powerfully, clear and authoritative, startling the two officers. "This is Chief Walter Reed, and you're preventing him from taking his wife to the hospital while she's in labor. Do you realize the gravity of what you're doing?" The officers, already somewhat shaken by the pressure from the crowd and the recording phones around them, grew visibly more nervous upon Keith's arrival. They exchanged anxious looks, realizing the situation had escalated now that a high-ranking and respected detective was involved. The shorter officer, appearing flustered but trying to keep his voice steady, replied, We're just doing our duty. He was speeding, and we have the right to pull him over." Keith raised an eyebrow, his gaze reflecting pure anger. He stepped closer to the shorter officer, his tone low but firm. "Doing your duty does not mean abusing your power. No regulation permits you to treat a family in a critical situation with such aggression. Can you not see her condition?" Keith pointed toward Nancy, who lay weakly in the car, her face twisted in pain as the contractions intensified. "This is not the time for a power trip. Your behavior is unethical and unprofessional." The two officers, especially the taller one, lost much of the confidence they'd shown earlier. He looked down, avoiding Keith's gaze, mumbling, We didn't know the situation was this serious." Keith shook his head, his face filled with disappointment. "Didn't know it was serious? You didn't even bother asking about her condition. All you saw was his skin color, and because of that, you overstepped your authority. This is my colleague, a man who has dedicated his life to upholding justice, and yet this is how you treat him?" Walter, still held against the car, felt a surge of hope and relief as he saw his loyal friend standing up for him and Nancy, willing to confront the officers to protect them. Walter knew that Keith was more than just a colleague. He was a friend who had his back, especially in the hardest moments. Keith turned to Walter, his eyes full of empathy and regret. He placed a firm hand on Walter's shoulder, speaking softly yet with determination. "Walter, I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. This should never have happened. They've crossed a line and I'll make sure they're held accountable." Walter nodded, feeling a mixture of sorrow and humiliation, but Keith's presence sparked a glimmer of hope. He knew his friend wouldn't let this incident be swept under the rug and would fight to protect him and Nancy to the end. Keith turned back to face the officers, his gaze cold and voice unyielding. "Listen up. I'm going to report everything that happened here to our superiors, and I'll ensure that you're held accountable for your abuse of power. This isn't just a wrongful act. It's a deep offense against my colleague and his wife. Don't think for a moment that this will go unnoticed. I'll personally see this matter through." The officers seemed overwhelmed by Keith's piercing gaze and the murmurs from the crowd. They were left without any defense, their faces shifting from arrogant confidence to anxious regret. The shorter officer quietly nodded, avoiding eye contact, while the taller one no longer dared to meet Keith or Walter's eyes. The crowd around them, witnessing Keith's resolute intervention, felt reassured and relieved. A few people nodded in agreement, understanding that justice was being restored through the intervention of a righteous figure. Phones continued to record every moment, capturing undeniable evidence of how the officers had treated Walter and Nancy. Keith approached Walter's car and leaned down to speak to Nancy, his eyes soft and compassionate. "Nancy, are you okay? I'm going to make sure you get to the hospital right away. No one has the right to stop you in this moment." Nancy, her forehead damp with sweat from the pain, looked up at Keith with grateful, tearful eyes. "Thank you, Keith," she whispered, her voice weak from the contractions. "We wouldn't know what to do if you hadn't come." Keith gently squeezed her hand, offering a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Nancy. You and Walter aren't alone. I'll make sure justice is served and that you're treated with the respect you deserve." After speaking to Nancy, Keith straightened up, his expression becoming serious once more as he turned back to the officers. "Now, I'll be escorting them to the hospital. If you have any intention of interfering further, go ahead and try, but I promise you, every action you take here tonight will be fully reported and made public." The officers had no courage left to resist. They exchanged looks, silently stepping back and avoiding Keith and Walter's eyes. The arrogance and authority they displayed earlier had completely vanished, replaced by shame and fear. Keith helped Walter back into the car and ensured Nancy was secure and comfortable. As he closed the car door, he spoke to Walter, his tone filled with resolve. "I won't let this get swept under the rug, Walter. I'll do everything I can to ensure justice is done. There's no place in our force for this kind of abuse and heartlessness." Walter looked at Keith with deep gratitude, his eyes showing appreciation and determination. "Thank you, Keith. You've always been there for me when I needed you most. We'll get justice, not just for Nancy and me, but for everyone who's had to endure this kind of mistreatment." Keith nodded, his eyes warm, but filled with a fierce resolve. "We'll fight to the end, Walter. This isn't just your battle. It's our mission to protect the values we've sworn to uphold." As the two colleagues and friends stood together, they felt a deep sense of unity and shared purpose. The crowd around them watched with admiration, trusting that justice would not be forgotten. This was only the beginning of a long road, but Walter knew that with Keith's support, he would no longer face injustice alone. As Keith stepped back, his stern gaze remained fixed on the two officers standing before him. These two, who had initially acted with arrogance and abuse of power, now seemed to realize that the situation had spiraled beyond their control. Under pressure from Keith and the angry stares of the surrounding crowd, the officers hesitantly approached Walter and Nancy, delivering an apology that they were forced to utter. The shorter officer, with a reluctant expression, spoke first. "I apologize for the trouble we caused you and your wife," and he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "We were just doing our job. If we went too far, I hope you can understand and forgive us." His apology sounded disjointed, lacking in sincerity, clearly uttered only to avoid further consequences. Walter looked directly at the officer, bitterness welling up inside him. He could see that these words were not born from genuine remorse, but were merely a shield against impending repercussions. When the taller officer stepped forward, however, his expression was markedly different. His eyes revealed genuine shame, and he lowered his head slightly before Walter and Nancy. "I am truly sorry," he said, his voice low and tinged with unease. "I didn't realize how serious the situation was. I allowed power and prejudice to cloud my judgment. Only when Detective David arrived and I understood the full context did I realize my mistake." Walter felt a hint of surprise, sensing the officer's sincerity. Though anger still burned within him, he recognized that this man stood before him with a genuine desire to make amends. The officer bowed his head further, his voice trembling with genuine regret. "Walter, I know that my words cannot undo what happened, but I want to commit to changing the way I work. I'll learn from this mistake and ensure I never repeat it." Walter stood still, feeling a faint spark of hope. Though he continued to feel betrayed and wounded, he understood that, at times, true remorse could be the catalyst for change. He looked directly into the officer's eyes, his voice steady but firm. "I hope you remember that our job is not only to enforce the law, but also to protect and respect people's rights." Keith stood silently beside them, observing the entire interaction. He sensed a small yet significant shift in the taller officer's attitude. Sometimes a moment like this could awaken a person's conscience. Keith knew that these apologies could be the first step toward reshaping their understanding of their responsibilities. When the apologies were finally spoken, whether sincere or forced, Keith turned back to Walter and Nancy with a reassuring look. He nodded, signaling that it was time for them to continue their journey to the hospital. Keith stepped forward, opened the car door, and helped Walter make sure Nancy was settled comfortably in her seat. Once he ensured everything was secure, he faced the officers one last time, his gaze cold, his words firm. "I'll be escorting these two to the hospital now. If anyone intends to interfere further or abuse their authority again, I'll make sure every action is fully reported and exposed in the name of justice." The officers had no courage left to protest. They exchanged uneasy glances, then quietly stepped back toward their patrol car, avoiding the eyes of both Keith and Walter. The confidence and bravado they had displayed earlier had evaporated, replaced by discomfort and shame. Walter watched them retreat, still feeling the weight of the situation, but his eyes shone with resolve. He knew this story was far from over, and these apologies, whether genuine or not, were only the beginning of a long journey toward justice. Keith helped him back into the car, his gaze filled with comfort and understanding. "We won't let this fade into obscurity, Walter. I'm committed to seeing this through to the end to ensure justice is served for you and Nancy. They will be held accountable for what they did," Keith said with firm resolve. Walter nodded, feeling the solid support of his loyal friend. As the car started moving, Keith activated his patrol lights and escorted them on the road to the hospital. The flashing lights led the way, allowing Walter and Nancy to reach safety more quickly. Throughout the drive, Walter held Nancy's hand tightly, his gaze tender, assuring her that everything was nearly over and that peace was finally within reach. Nancy, despite the unrelenting pain, felt a sense of relief and safety with Keith by their side. She knew that she and Walter were not alone and that Keith's friendship had been a source of strength, helping them endure this night. When they arrived at the hospital, Walter looked back down the road they had traveled, his heart filled with complex emotions. Tonight's events had been a profound lesson, a reminder that, sometimes, only in moments of pain and challenge do we see people's true nature. He recalled the taller officer's genuine apology, a reminder that, no matter how bleak things become, there is always the potential for awakening and change. As they stopped in front of the hospital, Keith remained steadfast, ready to protect his friends until the end. He watched Walter and Nancy step out, his eyes warm yet determined. He knew that this fight wasn't just about Walter and Nancy. It was a battle against the injustice that they, as police officers, had to confront and overcome. Walter turned back, taking Keith's hand in the silent gratitude. His gaze was filled with deep appreciation and resolve. Keith nodded, a silent promise that he would always stand by his friend. "Don't worry, Walter. We'll fight to the end, not just for you two, but for everyone who has ever faced injustice," Keith said, his voice steady and full of determination. As Walter and Nancy entered the hospital, they finally found a measure of peace after a long night of tension and pain. But they knew this was only the beginning. Walter was resolved to do everything in his power to ensure the truth would come to light and justice would be served, not only for him and Nancy, but for everyone else. Keith watched them fade into the hospital corridor, his heart filled with determination and the profound bonds of friendship. Tonight had been a powerful reminder of the values he and Walter cherished: justice, loyalty, and a deep sense of duty. This was only the beginning of a struggle, but he believed that, with perseverance and conviction, they would bring about true change and justice. After Nancy safely gave birth, Walter sat beside her hospital bed, gazing at the peaceful face of their newborn daughter sleeping in her mother's arms. In that moment, all his emotions seemed to settle, enveloped in a sense of family happiness and love. But as he looked into Nancy's eyes, memories of that harrowing night flooded back. Flashing lights, insults, the helplessness of seeing his wife disrespected and himself treated like a criminal in the middle of the street. He realized he could not stay silent and let this matter go. This offense was not only a threat to his dignity, but also to the future of his child and the world he wanted to protect and preserve for her. Walter resolved to seek justice, not only for his family, but also to prevent others from enduring the same humiliation and powerlessness. He knew he had to do this to uphold his belief in justice and the responsibility he had dedicated his life to. This was a fight he could not avoid, and Walter was determined to bring the incident to light. The next day, as soon as Nancy and their daughter were moved to the recovery room, Walter began carrying out his plan. He met with Keith, his loyal friend and a most trusted colleague, to map out the next steps. Keith, who had witnessed the injustice that night, fully supported Walter's decision. He wasn't just a friend, but a powerful ally, ready to stand by Walter in this challenging battle. Keith placed a reassuring hand on Walter's shoulder, his gaze filled with resolve. "You know you're not fighting this alone, right? I'll stand by you no matter what happens." Keith's words gave Walter strength, and he knew he could rely on his friends, loyalty, and integrity. Walter and Keith both understood that evidence was key to exposing the incident. They started by reaching out to the young man who had filmed the rough treatment Walter and Nancy endured. His video had already spread widely on social media, attracting thousands of views and a wave of public outrage. The young man, upon learning that Walter was seeking justice, readily provided the original video and pledged to testify if needed. The video became a crucial piece of evidence, but they didn't stop there. Walter and Keith began calling for other witnesses, including those who had seen the incident and those who had courageously contacted the police department when it occurred. Each statement, each video clip, and each photo became valuable pieces, assembling a complete picture of the truth about that night. Walter understood that this fight was not just his own. It represented everyone who had ever suffered injustice, discrimination, and abuse of power from those entrusted with upholding the law. To garner widespread support, he decided to reach out to the community and human rights organizations. Walter and Keith contacted multiple nonprofit organizations focused on protecting human rights and fighting discrimination. These organizations quickly rallied around Walter, not just because he was a police chief, but because he was a father, a husband, and a citizen fighting for values he believed in. A wave of community support began to form. Walter's story appeared in the media and spread widely. Major newspapers, television programs, and even celebrities spoke out in support of him. News articles analyzing the incident, interviews, and social media posts were constantly updated, calling for justice for Walter's family and condemning the abuse of power. On social media, thousands expressed their outrage at the way Walter and Nancy had been treated, while also calling for systemic reform. Walter felt his heart warmed by the empathy and support of so many people. This gave him greater confidence that justice would be served, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been mistreated and discriminated against. He realized this was no longer a personal battle, but a movement, a call for reform and transparency within law enforcement. Meanwhile, the two officers involved were scrambling to defend themselves and avoid accountability. They argued that they were simply following protocol and had no intention of disrespecting Walter. But with video evidence and witness testimonies, their abuse of power and dismissive attitudes were laid bare. The surge of public outrage would not allow them to escape the consequences of their actions easily. Despite the strong support, Walter and Keith still faced significant obstacles within the judicial system. They knew that filing a lawsuit against those in power was no easy task, especially within a system still riddled with barriers and protections for offenders within law enforcement. However, the unity of the community and their unwavering determination kept them moving forward through every challenge. Keith kept Walter updated on the case's progress and even organized meetings with human rights attorneys to explore the best legal strategies. When the case finally went to court, Walter's story became a beacon in the community. Others who had experienced discrimination and abuse of power began to come forward, sharing their stories and supporting Walter. Some even organized peaceful protests, demanding transparency and accountability within the police force. Messages like "Justice for All" and "Stop Abuse of Power" appeared across media outlets and social networks, turning Walter's fight into a nationwide movement. This movement extended beyond Walter's city, reaching other cities and states. People everywhere began to realize that they too had the right to demand justice and accountability from those charged with protecting them. The solidarity and strength of the community gave Walter renewed faith and fierce motivation, helping him stay resolute despite the challenges ahead. As the trial date approached, Walter knew this would be a pivotal moment in his life in the movement he had helped spark. He understood that he had to prepare as best as possible, not just for his family, but for all those watching and hoping for justice. With Keith and a team of committed lawyers, Walter meticulously prepared every detail to ensure that justice would prevail. On the way to the courthouse, Walter looked at Nancy and their newborn daughter with a gaze full of love and determination. This was no longer just a fight for his honor. It was a fight for his family, for justice, and for those who had no voice. Walter knew that, regardless of the outcome, he would never stop fighting for the values he held dear. Sitting beside him in the car, Keith placed a supportive hand on his shoulder and smiled encouragingly. "You're going to do great, Walter. This is our chance to bring justice to light. I'll be right here with you through it all." Walter squeezed Keith's hand, his heart filled with gratitude and resolve. He felt supported not only by his closest friend, but by the entire community, by those who had risen alongside him in this fight. Walter knew that no matter the verdict, he had inspired many to stand up for justice, and that he had planted seeds of hope for a fairer future. Entering the courtroom, Walter felt a surge of newfound strength, a powerful belief that justice would prevail. He was ready to face the challenge, not only for himself, but for all who longed for justice within a system that had once eroded their trust. The trial began under an air of intense anticipation that filled the courtroom. Walter took a deep breath, feeling his heart pounding, but steady. He looked around, meeting the eyes of residents who had come to support him. They too had faced similar injustices, and their presence reminded Walter that this fight was not his alone. Walter's attorney, an experienced and passionate advocate, began laying out the case. He analyzed every detail, presenting irrefutable evidence of abuse of power and systemic failures that Walter had endured. Each word he spoke carried weight, aiming to dismantle any possible excuses from the opposition. The defense attorneys, equally determined, used tactics to sow doubt, trying to weaken the evidence and distort the truth. Walter sat quietly, listening intently, his heart resolute. He knew this would be an intense battle of wits, one requiring steadfast patience and unwavering strength. When it was Walter's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. He slowly approached the stand, his gaze unyielding. He began recounting every detail he had endured, each instance of injustice, every feeling of being marginalized in the shadows. His voice was strong, and each word resonated with truth and emotion, touching everyone in the room. Walter spoke. "Today, I stand here, not only to seek justice for myself, but to give voice to all those who have been wronged and disheartened by this system. I believe that if we do not stand up, if we simply accept it in silence, then injustice will continue to spread, and our children will endure suffering they should never have to face." Walter's words reached everyone's hearts, and he saw many supportive, tearful gazes in the room. The jury listened intently, moved by his sincerity and determination. After Walter's testimony, his attorney continued to build the case, skillfully emphasizing key points and linking them to evidence with logical and compelling arguments. He stressed that this was not just a lawsuit, but an opportunity for the system to correct its wrongs, to show that justice is not an abstract concept, but a right that everyone deserves. The trial extended over hours as arguments from both sides interwove, but the atmosphere seemed to lean toward Walter's favor. His sincerity, resolve, and unyielding belief in justice resonated deeply. Finally, after tense moments of waiting, the jury adjourned for deliberation. Walter left the stand, feeling a mix of relief and hope. He knew that whatever the outcome, he had fought with everything he had, and at the very least, he had done all he could to bring about change. When the jury returned to the courtroom, an air of silent anticipation hung over the room. All eyes turned to the judge, awaiting the verdict. Walter sat beside Nancy, holding her hand tightly as a show of strength. She looked back at him, her eyes shining with pride and love. They had endured so much together, and now they faced this pivotal moment as one. The judge surveyed the courtroom before delivering the verdict, his voice solemn and steady. After careful review of all evidence and testimonies, the jury finds that the two officers in question grievously abused their authority, not only harming Walter, but also eroding public trust in the justice system. Walter felt his chest swell with emotion. This was the moment he and Nancy had longed for. The truth and justice finally acknowledged publicly. The judge continued, "As such, the jury rules that the two officers will be dismissed from their positions, required to compensate Walter for damages, and face appropriate legal penalties." At the conclusion, Nancy embraced Walter tightly, her eyes filled with joyous relief. At last, the suffering they had endured was vindicated. She whispered in his ear, "You did it, Walter. Justice has won." Walter turned to Nancy, his gaze reflecting his deep gratitude and love for his steadfast wife. In the courtroom, applause began to swell from those who had supported him. They had witnessed the relentless fight of Walter and Nancy, and now they could not contain their emotion as justice was served. Walter rose, joined by Nancy, bowing in gratitude to the judge and his attorney, who had stood by them throughout this battle. When the trial concluded and justice was served, Walter and Nancy walked out of the courtroom with a sense of relief and pride. Although the trial was just the first step in a long journey, it demonstrated that ordinary people like them could demand justice and fairness in a flawed system. The entire community had stood by them, supporting, encouraging, and rallying not only for their rights, but also for fairness for all. On the way home, Walter reflected on everything he had gone through. This challenging journey profoundly transformed him from someone who simply upheld the law to someone who fought for true justice and equality. He realized that not only his family, but many others out there longed for protection and fair treatment. Arriving home, Walter held his newborn daughter in his arms, looking into her innocent eyes. He knew that she was his motivation to keep fighting. That night, sitting by his daughter's bedside and watching Nancy smile in her sleep, Walter silently promised himself, "I will build a world where you can grow up without fear, without worrying about who you are or the color of your skin. I will do everything to ensure you can proudly live in a world where justice is for everyone." The next morning, Walter met with Keith and other colleagues to discuss the next steps. For Walter, the lawsuit was not an ending but the beginning of a movement. He wanted to fight for justice, not only for his family, but to reform the law enforcement system. He understood that only when everyone in the industry fully embraced their responsibility and mission could society become safer and fairer. With Keith and the community's support, Walter decided to engage more deeply in reform movements. He began organizing meetings and discussions with community leaders and those who had also been victims of abuse and discrimination. These gatherings became a space for sharing stories, where people could tell their own experiences and seek mutual support. Walter also began reaching out to nonprofit and human rights organizations for assistance and collaboration. He understood that to create real change, he would need support from many sides. These organizations willingly helped Walter organize workshops and training sessions for police officers to foster awareness and responsibility for citizens' rights. Walter believed that only when law enforcement internalized the principles of justice and compassion Could society become safer and healthier? Gradually, Walter's story spread not only throughout his city, but to other areas as well. People, near and far, heard about his and Nancy's struggle. The media quickly picked up on the story, continuously reporting on the movement Walter had initiated. Newspapers, television programs, and social media posts poured in, creating a wave of public support. Victims of discrimination and abuse now felt empowered to speak up, to tell their stories, and to demand justice. The number of people joining Walter's movement grew. Ordinary citizens, social activists, and even some like-minded police officers raised their voices in support. They joined peaceful protests, holding signs with slogans like "Justice for all" and "End abuse of power." Not only local citizens, but also many international organizations had took notice of Walter's movement. They sent their congratulations and pledged support in his fight against injustice. Leading human rights organizations continuously reached out to him, offering financial and legal aid, and even police training to improve the force's quality and ethics. Walter's persistence began to yield results. The police force started facing pressure to reform. Leaders in the sector had to implement new regulations on conduct, enhance internal oversight, and organize training on empathy and responsibility for officers. These programs helped officers understand their responsibilities better and taught them how to empathize, to put themselves in the shoes of those they served. Walter was invited to speak at major reform conferences, where he frequently shared his story. Each time he recounted it, he emphasized the importance of enforcing justice with integrity and impartiality. He believed that sharing his story served not only as a reminder of the importance of fairness, but also as an inspiration for future generations. New officers joining the force began to see their roles differently. They understood that they were not just law enforcers, but also protectors of citizens' rights and safety. Walter's presence in the field served as a reminder of the noble values they needed to uphold. One evening, as Walter and Nancy strolled through the park with their young daughter, he watched children playing and laughing all around. He looked at his daughter's innocent face and pure smile and promised himself he would do everything to protect that smile. He knew this fight might last a lifetime, but he was undaunted. With every action, Walter hoped that one day his daughter would grow up in a world where she could take pride in a father who never stopped fighting for justice. Walter sat beside his daughter, holding her close. He whispered to her, as an eternal promise, "I will build a world where you are free to be yourself, without fear because of your skin color or anything else. I will fight so you can grow up in a fair and safe society." Nancy sat beside him, quietly holding Walter's hand, her eyes sparkling with pride and love. "You've done more than you realize, Walter. Not just for us, but for so many others. You've inspired them, and I believe future generations will remember you as a symbol of justice." Walter turned to Nancy, his eyes full of gratitude and resolve. They knew this was only the beginning of a long journey, but neither had any intention of giving up. They had created change, and they would continue to uphold it, not just for themselves, but for everyone who longed for a brighter future. Walter's life became a symbol of perseverance and courage in the fight for justice. He continued participating in conferences and reform programs, and tirelessly advocating to ensure these changes would not be forgotten. Walter knew he was fighting not only for his family, but for all those who had felt forgotten and unjustly treated. In the years that followed, Walter and Nancy watched their daughter grow up in an improved world. Although there was still much work to do, they saw their efforts had not been in vain. They had laid a foundation for the future, a future where fairness and compassion would be the stronghold of society. And when Walter looked into his daughter's eyes, he saw all the hopes and dreams he had worked so hard to fulfill. It was a world where everyone had the right to be respected, to live without fear, and to be free from discrimination. Walter knew he had laid the first bricks for a brighter future, one where his daughter and all children could live in peace and freedom. With steadfast resolve and love for his family, Walter continued his journey, forever a warrior for justice and equality, not just for today, but for generations to come. This incredible story reminds us of the importance of defending justice and standing against abuse of power in all circumstances. Walter never backed down, ready to demand fairness not only for himself and his family, but for the community. If you were in his shoes, would you have the courage to stand up and seek justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below, And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to follow more inspiring stories like this. See you next time.